I've known Greg Sandow for 30 years.
Is that true?
Well, yes.
It's scary, Judith,
It's
but
scary.
kind of wonderful.
Yeah, that was when you were 12. And actually, back then, he was one of the few people I would call a cultural critic, someone who could bring really original thinking across disciplines and share ideas that just you would never have thought of before. And that creativity has brought him a very active career as a blogger and a consultant and a teacher. And he's worked with a number of orchestras over the years. He's also been an active member of the graduate faculty at Juilliard for more than 17 years. And he was active with something else that many of you may be familiar with, the Mellon Orchestra Forum, which was really an attempt to rethink and revision what orchestras could be. So Greg has a tremendous amount of experience and a really unusual perspective, and it's a real pleasure to introduce him and have him with us today. Thanks, Greg.
Oh, Judith, thanks so much. I guess I don't need that. Thanks. She asked me, what she should say in introducing me, and you didn't use any of it, which I loved. You said much better stuff. With the Mellon Foundation Orchestra Forum, I often described my position as I'm 007, I have the license to kill, which meant actually I could go to any meeting and say anything. Listening proved, though, much more useful than talking. And it was fun. Maybe I'll get a job like that at the Pentagon someday. No, I don't think so. So today, I'm going to do something really a little bit crazy, maybe. We're going to dream. We're going to dream about 2023. And we're going to imagine that all of your orchestra's problems are solved. That you have a new and excited, vibrant, young audience. Just fills your hall. Maybe not impossible at the University of Maryland, by having the students in the orchestra organize and promote the orchestra in their dorms and fraternities. They did get a vibrant young audience thronging their hall. Maybe people in college will come to your concerts on dates. That's not impossible. I have a lot of reports actually from the Philadelphia Orchestra in the 1950s. It's in Herbert Kupferberg's book, for one thing, on the history of the orchestra, where that happened. You could have college nights for different colleges in your area, and they would be thronged. That's not crazy. That was actually done by orchestras in the past. The Boston Pops would do it, and when it was MIT night, the MIT students would snake dance through the streets from their campus in Cambridge, across the Charles River into Boston. And when it was Harvard night, they had to call out extra police because the Harvard students were rowdy. They would make a lot of noise and demand to hear the Academic Festival Overture. True story. And in the 1920s, when a great soprano retired, her teenage fans at the Met strung banners from one side of the house to another. So, these things are not unprecedented. They could happen. In 2023, we're going to pretend that the entire community is buzzing about you. And it's measurable because you can track references to you on Twitter. And you discover that people are tweeting about you who never even go to your concerts because the orchestra is creating that much excitement in your community. People go to your concerts, they listen to you online, they download everything you've got, they buy your recordings, they buy your merchandise, and not only in your store should you have one, but in stores all over town. Of course you have no funding problems, and you do this without any artistic compromise. As a matter of fact, you are probably freer than you've ever been to do whatever programming you want without worrying that it's going to offend your audience, because your audience is so excited by everything you do. Probably not impossible, because when the New York Philharmonic a couple of seasons ago programmed a concert version of Ligeti's opera Le Grand Macabre, subscribers turned in their tickets more or less en masse, And they sold every one of them to excited young people in New York. I was there. They had 3 big, sold-out, happy, enthusiastic houses. Not saying possible everywhere at every time, but possibilities exist. So think about this for a minute, and I just want to ask you a few questions about yourselves. Can I have a show of hands? Who is here from a group 1 or 2 orchestra? Ooh, impressive. I better watch what I say. And the rest of you, I of course assume, are from groups 3 or 8 or not from orchestras at all. How many marketing people? Okay, development people? Board members? Artistic administrators? Getting a nice assortment. Musicians? Yay. Musicians and marketing. What orchestra is that? I'm sorry? Okay, cool. You play in the orchestra and you do the marketing. Probably more common than I know. Conductors? Yeah, I know you. Publicity? Education? GMs and OPS, as it says, ops. Volunteers? Oh, good category. And then I know there are some people from outside the orchestra field entirely. I spot a journalist I know. Actually, my friend Phil Kennicott from the Washington Post. My wife is the chief classical music critic there. And actually, we go back longer than that, she and you and I, but now we're great friends. So having done that, let's return to the dream. 2023, vibrant young audience, community buzz, problems solved. I would like you quickly, off the top of your head, to write down 3 reasons why we don't have that now. Don't censor yourselves, don't think, write it down. Paper, electronic devices. I'll give you a moment to do it. And then I would like to hear what some of these reasons are. Okay, anybody want to volunteer some reasons? Yes.
We're doing the same things, expecting different results.
Oh, the classic definition of insanity. Yes.
We are stuck in a rut.
Okay.
Kind of similar, but we're not thinking big enough. We're not thinking out of the box.
Okay. Somebody else? Yes.
Severely dysfunctional board and an absentee music director.
Ooh. Shall we ask you the name of your orchestra? Yeah, yeah. Oh, Alan, hi, very nice to meet you. Yeah.
Audience didn't like the music, didn't like outmoded traditions, and found better alternatives.
You guys are more radical than I am. It's very interesting. What are your reasons?
Limited staff, lack of involvement in education in the community.
Can everybody hear that? No. The first reason was one I want to settle on for a moment, limited staff. I am really well aware, especially after working with the Pittsburgh Symphony and the Cleveland Orchestra, for example, of how even the biggest orchestras are pretty much maxed out in terms of budget and staff time, just doing what they do. And so, of course, it's hard to suddenly say, okay, brand new direction, brand new thing. So I sympathize. That is a real problem. Let me see. What were your reasons?
I think for me, the big reason operating in a crisis mode prevents us from thinking long-term and investing in long-term potential solutions.
Yeah, I think orchestras are probably not the only institutions that do this, but yes, operating in crisis mode. How are we going to make payroll? How are we going to get through this year? How are we going to sell enough tickets? Oh my God, we have a budget deficit. What are we going to do? There's a lot of that. Deborah Borda said to me a long time ago when I was a journalist, writing about orchestras, that the orchestras individually and as an industry didn't really have an R&D component. And also, profit-making companies launch new products all the time, and many of them fail, and they plan for that. They expect it. Of course, the League, to some extent, is the R&D branch of the orchestra industry. Yeah. A little
risk capital.
Yes, you need risk capital. If I understand what you're saying, you need to have some money squirreled away where you can say, this is the money we're going to spend on taking risks. And if we lose it, that's what we planned. Actually, any investor, who's an active, aggressive investor, has that. So, yeah, David.
Fear of offending long-time supporters and subscribers.
Man, isn't that true? Fear of offending the long time. I really have a consciousness that orchestras and probably the whole classical music industry, on one hand, has to keep doing what you're doing because that's who's buying your tickets, who's giving you the money. And on the other hand, you have to embark on what might be a completely new path. And how do you have the resources to do both? And how do you make sure you do it without, as you say, offending the established people? So these are important things, and I would say that to a certain extent we can lay them aside because we are, after all, dreaming. And then we should always beware the gospels of despair. One of my favorites is, nobody said this, nobody likes classical music anymore. Nobody's educated in it, so people don't care about what we do. We should beware of blaming others for our problems and watch out for thoughts that prevent us from thinking what we could do on our own and how we could overcome the problems you're all naming. We should think of successes. And actually, one of my favorites, about which I'm going to learn a lot more in future weeks when I have a conversation with them, is Present Music, a new music book group in Milwaukee, which has, last time I talked to them, a couple of hundred subscribers, and then sells a couple of hundred tickets for their concerts on top of that. This is new music in Milwaukee. And how do they do it? I'm going to have that conversation, but I noticed on their website that they have an audience development committee with 15 people on it. So I said, oh, look at that. I think they prioritized this. And that's one of the reasons I imagine they do it. Also, the Toronto Symphony, which says a third of its audience is under 35. One thing I know they did is they just persevered with big discounted tickets and with special concerts for young people, but not for a year or two or three, but for well over a decade. And I think the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment in London, which has 1,000 people who come to late night repeat performances of some of its regular concerts. These people are young and not at all like the classical music audience. So there are signs it can be done. I will quote from South Pacific, from the song Happy Talk. Gotta have a dream. If you don't have a dream, how are you gonna have a dream come true? So in our dream, the orchestra has power, orchestra can change itself, and the orchestra can change the reality it deals with, or at least make people in the city react to it very differently from the way they react now. So one last thought, maybe we are not in this 2023 place because we haven't seriously tried to get there, for all the understandable reasons that you said. So now, proceeding further, I'm going to ask you to take a couple of steps, and at certain moments I'm going to, like in a Monopoly game, we land on the chance square, and I'm just going to pick a card and throw a situation at you. So, first thing, imagine it is 2023, and you're looking back. I would like you to quickly write down one thing that happened in the first or second year, something that gave you a sign, oh my God, it's working, all of this can change. Might be a really big thing, might be a small thing, but something you did or something that happened in the community or both. If you have more than one thing, write them all down, but certainly one thing, the sign that came to you where you saw, oh my God, this could really work. Give you a moment for that. Let me descend upon you. I see you writing. What did you write?
Well, this is traditional, but for us, subscriptions are actually working really, really well.
Oh, nice. So did everybody hear that?
No, sorry. For us, subscriptions are working really, really well. 85% of our cost is sold on subscription.
Wow.
And that's increased from about 50% in the past 3
Colorado
years.
Springs Philharmonic. So, and you prefaced that when you were just talking to me by almost apologetically saying, this is traditional, but if the traditional stuff works, go do it. And I think one thing that I have learned, and in particular from one gentleman I see sitting here, that the traditional stuff needs to be applied in the best possible way, to the max. Even if you think you need to go in completely new paths, better do the traditional stuff as well as you can. So congratulations for that. And long may it continue. So anybody else want to volunteer? Yes, Donna.
Every time for the past 17 years, every time I've said to people, I'm with the Bloomington Symphony, they say, oh, you're with the Pops. The Pops is a different orchestra, they're actually out of business. They
Yeah.
So I want them to say, you're with the Bloomington Symphony?
Okay, so that would happen. And that would really be interesting. You all heard that from the Bloomington, Indiana Symphony. She says she's from that. People think she's from a Pops orchestra that's now defunct. So the sign would be people you would be from the symphony. Now, I have one personally. I was at a dinner party once with a nice array of people. There was a famous cultural theorist. There was a well-known mystery writer. I'm not trying to brag on myself. It's just who happened to be there, and it sets up the story. And some actors and actresses. This is in New York City. And very active conversation about many things. I'm the newcomer. What do you do? I work in classical music. Conversation grinds to a halt because nobody knows what to say. So my sign have changed like yours. That doesn't happen. That doesn't happen. People say, wow. As somebody once did say to me at the 40th birthday party of one of my wife's college friends, oh, you're in classical music? You know, I just moved to New York from San Francisco, and when MTT conducted Ives' Fourth Symphony of the Maverick series, I was thrilled. She didn't go to other classical concerts, but those really did reach her, so can happen. Other things that might happen. You? Yes, you.
I would like to say that we invented, with Converse subscription idea, a new way of delivering our tickets and filling our seats the way young people.
Yeah.
They don't subscribe.
Right.
To a long-term thing. So I would like to say, wow, we figured that out.
So did everybody hear that? Different way of delivering tickets, not subscription, adapted to younger people who don't subscribe in advance and may not even make their plans before the evening of the concert. How do you reach them? So if you knew you were doing that, that would be a great sign. Somebody else? Yes?
The orchestra gave permission for audience members to photograph and film
Whoa!
and share it over YouTube and other online, generating huge interest by young people who come to enjoy the concert.
You know, I think that that is really profound in many ways. I have noticed, and I will name a name, at the Kennedy Center, at National Symphony concerts, the very first thing that happens is the shaken finger on the PA system. No cell phones, no photography, no recording. And I'm thinking, oh, isn't this great? No, welcome, happy to see you. Hope you love the music, but don't do this, don't do that, don't do the other thing. Probably not the way you want to meet people. And then, you know, in pop music, used to be people held up their lighters during the power ballads. Now they hold up their cell phones so their friends can hear it. And God knows that's forbidden in classical music, but if it happened, you certainly would know that people loved what you did and that their friends loved what you did. And going back to the old days, the prohibition against applauding between movements was really only uniform in this country by the 1950s, not earlier. And in Mozart's time, people applauded during the music the minute they heard anything they liked. And again, forbidden now, but my God, if you're playing the Eroica Symphony, or you're playing the Ninth, let's say, and suddenly the timpani solos in the scherzo, applause from the audience, that happened at the premiere. But if that happened in your concerts, you would know, oh my God, they care. And my Juilliard students often say, I love our audience, but I wish I knew what they were thinking. So a really active relationship between you all and the audience would be interesting. One more? Anybody? Yes. Yeah.
We have two universities in our city, Tallahassee, and I would love for them to just overrun the hall and have a very diverse college concert.
That would be cool. Is Florida State one of them?
Florida State and A&M University, two completely different, but I would love to have both of them included.
My wife and I were in residence once at Florida State. We had a great time. But it's really true that you can have these little silos of music within a university. I know at the University of Maryland, where I was artist in residence for a couple of years, they didn't even reach outside the music school for their audience to the rest of the university, and they didn't even reach out to the music school. Even the music students didn't come to the orchestra concerts. Okay, Monopoly. Land on the chance square, draw the card. The card says, it's February. What month is that, somebody? That is Black History Month. Sorry. It's a lot of things. Okay, I hear what you're saying, but for my purposes, and actually nationally, it is Black History Month. And let's imagine that in your town, there is a dynamic young, I'll say she's Hispanic, mayor, and she's decided she wants to really celebrate the ethnicities in your town, and she wants to do something big that many organizations in the community will participate in for Black History Month. So there's a meeting of cultural and community organizations, and people are saying in advance what they think they're going to do. Theater company, I admit, has it very easy. They're going to do 2 plays from August Wilson's Pittsburgh cycle, in which he depicts elements of African American life from the 1900s, decade by decade, to the 1990s. The dance company, or maybe one of them, maybe there's more than one, has done a new dance celebrating 2 eras of black music, alternate bits of blues and hip hop they're going to choreograph too. The art museum is going to show outsider art by African Americans in past generations. I've seen a show like that at the Museum of Visionary Art in Baltimore, and it was staggering what had been done by unheralded people who were not part of the arts community. Many of them, in fact, African American. And the Historical Society is just beaming with pride because they have unearthed a guy who runs a barber shop who was the lead singer in the most prominent doo-wop group in your town in the 1950s, and the record label who recorded them was black-owned, which was really very rare. So they're going to have a panel discussion featuring him. And now, all eyes are on you. What is your orchestra going to do? What is it going to do? What's your orchestra going to do? Play music by black composers. And who, for example? Whom?
Adolphus Hailstorm.
This is good. And people from the black community say, with respect, but a little puzzlement, you know, we don't know that name. And we're curious, does his music reflect our culture?
Difficult question to answer.
I know. That's why I asked it. Sometimes when you're dealing with a dream, you have to be hard-nosed. I understand it's not a, no, but I think that that is a question you might get. A lot of people are going to say, I asked this in my Juilliard class. Not an African-American face here. Did have an African-American student in my Juilliard class, and of course for him, I had to be a little careful because I went around the room, made everybody answer. When I came to him, I said, Kari, this may have special meaning for you for obvious reasons, but it may not, on the other hand. I don't want to point the finger and say you're the spokesman for your people, but he did have a lot to say. But that was actually a concern, that a lot of prominent in classical music African-American composers really aren't known in the African-American community and don't write music that particularly reflects its culture. So yes, what?
You could do like Joplin, Ellington,
Yeah.
Why not do his songs?
You do his songs in what form?
Either if he still sings, he could come and do one, or find guys who could sing the songs that he sang in the 50s.
That would be interesting. And then you could have some young American composer who's really very fluent in pop music write serious orchestra arrangements. Other thoughts? You know, one thing about that is that it's not a bad idea. It's also sort of predictable, and it's a long time ago. Other groups in the community are sort of reacting to more contemporary black culture. But then again, look at our repertory in general, so it's not a crazy thing. So yes?
I'm from Hilton Head, and we're in kind of the center of Gullah country.
Yeah,
And so we have done things like we bring in Sphinx soloists,
yeah.
Black and Latino, and actually did an orchestral arrangement of Kumbaya, which was a Gullah spiritual. So again, capturing kind of our local,
Mm-hmm. And what's the reaction to that?
very, very positive.
Oh, nice.
Across demographics. A lot of pride in the fact that this is a song that came from here.
Oh, yeah. And also there's the sense of people being recognized. You know, here's this orchestra. We didn't think it had much to do with us, but now look, they actually are paying serious attention. Other ideas?
We actually are lucky, we have David Baker living in Bloomington.
Yeah.
And his daughter plays in our orchestra.
Yeah.
And we commissioned him to write a piece for us 2
Mhm.
years ago, so we use him a lot.
And was there a reaction from the black community?
Yeah, it was pretty much sold out.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
So now, I once did in the 1990s as a journalist a piece about African Americans in classical music. I had to be dragged into it kicking and screaming by my editor at the time. I was writing for a weekly paper in New York. And I said, I don't know anything about this. I don't feel qualified to write it. He said, write it anyway. It was such an educational experience for me. And it was fascinating talking to African Americans in New York City who were sort of prominent in the classical music field, and their fury at some of the things New York organizations had done because they never did it again. You know, the New York City Opera premiered, I guess in the 80s, Anthony Davis's X, an opera on the life of Malcolm X. And I think when I went to the premiere that the hall was a third African American, which is not your standard classical audience. But then they never, ever returned to that. You know, another organization, American Composers Orchestra, commissioned a piece from jazz musician. They used gospel choirs. Again, you know, involvement in the black community, black turnout. They never went back. And people really noticed that. So it's kind of tricky for building a long-term relationship. I'm going to give you some thoughts about things that could be done. Not saying the ideas you all have had are awful, but just stuff I've run into that interested me. When I was writing this piece, I met, and I'm so ashamed that I can't remember his name now, a cellist, African-American with the Cincinnati Symphony, who told me that in the late 1960s, Aretha Franklin had done a show in a big club in New Jersey, demanded strings, and demanded that all the players be black. So maybe 1968, the black classically trained string player is not something on everybody's consciousness. So the club owner had to really scramble and find people. So the cellist told me he was one of them. And suddenly, all of these people playing in Aretha Franklin's string section look around at each other and say, we didn't know you all were there. And it was the beginning of a wonderful kind of development of consciousness and encouragement for people who were doing something not common for people of their ethnicity to do. So that's an interesting piece of history that you might even have going on in your own orchestras that you might unearth. The Brooklyn Philharmonic, trying to relate to communities in Brooklyn, went to Bedford-Stuyvesant, big black neighborhood, and rather than try to figure out how to bring Beethoven and Brahms into Bed-Stuy, they had long conversations with community leaders saying, what is it that makes sense to you, that speaks your cultural language, that also speaks ours, that we could do? And they came up with a collaboration with a hip hop star from the community named Mos Def. Now he's known as Yasmin Bey, but he made his fame under the name Mos Def. So they got Derek Bermel, American composer some of you may know, who is an avid, insane actually, hip hop fan, to write orchestral versions of Mos Def's backing tracks, which I heard, and it's just uncanny. There was fabulous orchestra music and fabulous hip hop, and Mos Def did some of his songs. And then they had Mos Def doing a piece by Frederick Shevsky involving a speaking voice. So he's doing new classical music, and the orchestra is doing hip hop. Alan Pearson, the music director, is a hip hop fan also. So it worked. And they got just tremendous turnout in the history in Mos Def. Yasmin Bey was so excited, he wanted to keep collaborating with them. So there's a thought. And then a writer I know named Elaine Mack did a beautiful book, Black Classical Musicians in Philadelphia, Oral Histories Covering 4 Generations. And what she unearths in the book is this just fabulous history of active classical music making and enjoyment in the Philadelphia black community going way, way, way back. It reminded me of something Michael Morgan once told me, the music director of the Oakland Symphony, who is African American. He said, previous generations, a lot of African Americans interested in classical music, but because of the racial climate of the time, hardly any opportunity to make careers. Now those barriers are down, but the interest isn't there. And Elaine really documented the first part of that. So I'm thinking that an orchestra could embark on that oral history in its own community and upstage the historical society, because like my dinner party companions, they didn't even think in terms of classical music and didn't realize that there might be a history to talk about in Black History Month. Well, don't have to dwell on this longer. The reason I dwelt on it for a long time, besides that it's kind of something that interests me, is to make this point, that if we imagine 2023 and the community is taking an active and vibrant interest in what you do, then you presumably are taking an active, vibrant interest in what the community does. And that it goes both ways, and that for a classical music organization, it might take you into parts of the community that you didn't have much contact with or hadn't much thought about. Give you another example. I thought of making this a Monopoly card, but I didn't. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York is having a big show now on punk fashion, starting with the actual punks in the 70s and going forward to fashion designers being inspired by that, which is a big thing. So this, if you believe the New York Times, for a week or so was the biggest cultural event in New York, to judge by the amount of coverage. So if that happened in your town, nobody would expect the orchestra to collaborate with the museum on this, because orchestras and punk, that's a non-starter. But if you did, my God, would you be in the news? And would everybody sit up and say, wait a minute, I don't think we understood what this orchestra was about. So that is an interesting lesson, that you really have to get involved with the community. One other thing I thought of, and then I will promise you leave this subject. I was listening to the really inspiring part of Jesse's talk yesterday. We talked about, among other things, how little arts education there was in a place like East St. Louis. You know, poor, often minority communities. And I'm thinking, yeah, that's true. And I'm thinking about the South Bronx in New York, which is now in pretty good shape. It used to be a wreck. And no, there's no arts education there. On the other hand, all by themselves, they developed hip hop. And they had a multi-billion-dollar industry now and a new art form, and they did it all by themselves. So it's interesting sometimes not to have the missionary point of view, let us bring art to these people, but to sit back and say, wait a minute, let's listen to them. What do they do on their own? And then, maybe in that way, develop more of a community collaboration. Since I talked so much about this, does anybody want to comment on that before we go on? Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to observe that the answers you got from around the room were mostly sort of an assumption of unilateral responsibility on the part of the orchestra. We program, we commission, we decide. And the answers you offered, Phil, were about becoming a platform for other parts of the community to use the resources and sort of tools of the orchestra.
Yeah. Hey, Peter, good point. And I think that that applies across the board. When you are doing outreach, outreach could really be two ways. That you can learn so much about the world you're in and find ways that you apply to it that you didn't think, interests people might have in what you did that you didn't expect, new things you can do, your own perspective might really shift. That's a really good point. I think a lot of arts thinking and classical music thinking is kind of from the top down. We have this great art form and how can we get people to understand it? Rather than also saying the culture has changed and there's all this stuff going on that actually a lot of us participate in our non-classical music time, but that doesn't often play a part of what we do professionally. Anybody else want to comment? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Greg.
Hi.
As a composer, I've discovered ways to use the folk music of our time,
Yeah.
rock, Latin, hip hop, and blend it
Oh,
with
Rick,
classical
hiya.
counterpoint.
Yeah, I didn't recognize you at
So,
first.
yeah, it's a great way to acknowledge the community and give it familiar rhythms in the context of development, which is what most of our instrumental music is about.
Yeah, this is Rick Robinson, who was, what is the word, Rick, ballsy enough to actually leave the Detroit Symphony, not because they were having trouble, but when they were actually on the upswing, because you wanted to do your own thing. And a lot of it is bringing classical music to new audiences. And I will give you this shout out, which I know I've given to you personally. The music you write sounds like it comes from a universe in which there was never a separation between African American culture and the classical tradition. I don't know how you do that, except that you internalize both. But it's kind of inspiring to hear. Okay, let me move on. Let's now look back from 2023 at the first 5 years of the evolution and write down something else, some maybe kind of large thing that happened that made you see not just, oh my God, there's a possibility here, but look at this. We're really accomplishing something and we're in a new place. Just dream it. What would it be? Write it down. Don't censor. Write it down fast. You, sir. What did you write down? You're still thinking. You know, these things are not easy. So what did you write down? You didn't write down anything. You still, do others of you need more time to think? Maybe that was a big one. Okay, take more time. The question was, earlier I said, look back from 2023 at the first year or two and think of something, even a small thing, that might have happened that makes you feel, oh my God, this is going somewhere. And now look back on the first 5 years and try to find something big, some development where you really start saying, we really see that we're starting to be in a different place. Yeah, Jonathan, I see you, but just let me give people a few more minutes since the two people I descended upon said they wanted that. Jonathan, since you had your hand up.
Well, I speak a little bit from outside the norm probably of this community.
Can everybody hear him?
Sorry, I'm speaking from a little bit outside of the norm because I don't work at an orchestra. I'm an educator at the University of Missouri. But one of the things that I think would be really, really important for all of these discussions is that young professionals, musicians who are training to become professionals, would vision more broadly about what they can do and are more empowered over the multiplicity of their careers. So rather than saying, I want to be a violinist or I want to be a pianist, to vision more of the impact. So I want to be in the marketing, and I'm really interested in connecting what I do with community, and therefore can vision for multiple satisfying roles.
And if that happened, then the younger musicians coming into your orchestras will all have that kind of head. And as you and I know, and others here doubtless know, music schools are really starting to stress entrepreneurship, to kind of develop that thought in their graduates, and also, just realistically, since careers are harder to make, to give business skills so that musicians can make careers on their own. So returning now to you, yes.
Well, to your earlier point,
Yeah.
I think in 5 years, you have not only a more diverse audience, but more subscribing.
That would be something, and wouldn't it be wonderful that you combine the new, a vastly, I add vastly, more diverse audience than we see now, but they do what the old audience did, subscribe. You think that's likely? You think they would be subscribers?
No, it's not like that, because they will, the younger people behave differently.
Right.
Than the traditional.
Right.
Sort of the traditional audience.
Yeah.
But there would be evidence in 5 years.
Yeah.
That you are reaching a more diverse part of your audience on a sustainable basis.
Yeah. And so how likely do you think the more diverse audience is, if you grant that the subscribers would be maybe a stretch?
That all depends upon the product and the marketing of that product and the purpose that you go out after that market.
Yeah.
If you go after that market with a purpose that reaches that market, I think it's very likely that you'll have more diversity.
And that's kind of Present Music with their 15-person committee for audience development. But, maybe you don't get subscribers, but maybe you get fantastic brand loyalty. The Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment really did that. They started a campaign, which they launched with a very funny video, to get people from their audience who didn't look like the traditional classical music audience to become, in a sense, their spokesmodels. And they ended up getting 8 insanely diverse people, very fashion-forward, yes, tattoos and piercings, a bodybuilder, but they was genuinely from their audience, and they have used that to rebrand themselves as the night shift for their late night concerts, which they've done very well for. So if you get people coming repeatedly, even if they don't commit that in advance, that would be fabulous. So what did you write down?
I think to successfully implement a strategic plan and actually balance the budget. Couples fiscal responsibility and community engagement.
I think that's very nice. Do you see these things going in different directions, fiscal responsibility and community engagement? Is that a danger?
I think they're often not because often it's seen more important to do something as our place.
I'm sorry?
I think often the thought is one more important than the other, so when we have them sacrifice.
Yeah, and probably balancing the budget is likely to be the more important one. And kind of understandably, because not making payroll, that would be terrible, building up a huge deficit. It's also true, by the way, that the Met Opera funded their streaming performances in movie theaters initially from endowment draw, though they don't like to talk about that in public. So there was a question of a big institution making an investment in its future of doing something differently. And I think, I'm very glad you brought that up, because I think investment is probably necessary. Resources will have to be found that in the ordinary day-to-day operation would be very hard to commit. But if you're going to make a determined effort to go to a new direction, it really will cost you something. And interesting to think where that's going to come from, and also what the rewards of it could be. You know, can the benefits you get from it be monetized? So, what did you write down? Yes.
I'm from Baltimore.
Yeah.
I work for my,
Oh, nice. Who are you?
I'm the marketing.
Oh,
VP.
hi.
So I have a marketing statement.
Yeah.
I think I'd like to say, at least in Baltimore.
Can everybody hear her?
I'd like to
Great.
say that in Baltimore, that we successfully, in 5 years, that we successfully transitioned to a purely digital consumption of all things Baltimore Symphony. For a lot of reasons, I mean, I think within 10 years, everyone will be there, but, you know, the program actually converts to loyalty and tickets so that they're, you know, you're no longer doing print ads. Everything is digital. All your dynamic content is working to sell tickets. Program notes, all the concert audience engagement, everything is digital. Obviously, it would save money, but I do think I just read Steve Jobs' bio. I think that's why my head is there, but I think the nature of our business is, you know, it should be consumed digitally at this point, but I do think that orchestras
And
are funded to get.
They are, and I'm thinking I have got to take a MARC train down and just hang out with you all for a while, because I know that Baltimore, some extraordinary things are happening, and I should have mentioned that. I believe that you have just upturned the idea that orchestras are not visible in their community. I think you have created a lot of buzz. Am I dreaming there? Is that right?
So there's buzz, I think, in the digital realm.
Yeah.
Just like everyone else, we need to be doing more. So I think it's more of a societal trend than just for our industry, and we're, as always, trying to catch up. But
Yeah.
I think some of the R&D, this risk capital, needs to be put there.
But you know, a nice piece of R&D that you all did is the idea of teaming up with the Parsons School of Design to have students design new concert dress. And I thought that was brilliant, because new concert dress is a great idea, but if you just tried to find a fancy fashion designer to do it, it would cost you an arm and a leg. And what if it was bad? What if the musicians hated it? But to work with students and have it developed bit by bit, and then to partner with the Mannes College of Music in New York and have them try it out in a concert, I thought that was a really brilliant approach.
Scripted, you know, we sort of call it non-inherent.
Yes, exactly.
Something, and we thought about it, the organic, sort of educational feeling of that, and also not knowing what the outcome will be or when it will be. It's something really exciting.
Yes.
Very, very reflective.
In 1989, I was a consultant, believe it or not, to the Grammys, and they did have a full symphony orchestra, which is why they got me involved. And they did have a designer design dress, and the musicians bitched and moaned about it, which, you know, we know musicians, forgive me, those of you who are, it happens. But you can't really just parachute that stuff in. Okay, somebody else about the 5 years? Oh, well, I want somebody who hasn't spoken yet. Yes?
As a frequent audience member of music,
Can everybody hear her?
I have a couple of radical ideas
Oh, great.
that I call back to the future. First is, as audience members, I would love to see people live in and experience the moment and spend less time downloading, photographing, and storing for future use, which many people never use again. But that's not all or nothing. You can do it sometimes, but not always. Secondly, less categorization and labeling. If I lived in a community and was constantly called underserved, it would make me feel offended. I think we should go to those communities because they're part of the community and it's a good thing to do. Let's not label these people.
Oh, yeah.
We should go every place.
Oh, yeah. And let's be friends with them, and let's return. I noticed that the National Symphony, and I don't mean Washington, I don't mean to criticize them particularly, but they do have a neighborhood program where they showed up in a neighborhood actually close to where Ann and I live, and they did stuff for a day. I don't think they're ever going to go back there. I also know a very large orchestra that does educational programs in the school, and I asked somebody intimately involved if they ever surveyed the teachers and students to find out how they'd like these programs, and they didn't, which was interesting. So two-way streets are really, really important. I got another Monopoly card for you. Tabitha Coffee comes to town. Anybody know that name? You don't spend enough time flipping channels on your TV. Ann and I, who also don't really do that very much, discovered a show called Tabitha Takes Over. Okay, so you do know the show. Tabitha Coffee, a hair designer and salon owner and entrepreneur, looks like she could overthrow the government of a small country simply by showing up at passport control. And on this show, she descends upon hair salons that aren't working very well, and she fixes them, often with very, very fierce resistance. So let's pretend she's doing that in your town, and one of your donors has TV contacts and finds out about it and pays Tabitha to come and work with the orchestra for a little bit. So what I've seen her do with hair salons is, for example, get after the way the staff dresses. You don't look neat, you don't look attractive, I want you to look contemporary, I want you to look professional, and you over there, I don't want you to look as trendy as you do, because that's too much and you're going to scare the customers. She works on all kinds of customer relations. Is this a place where it's friendly and efficient, and when people walk in, they immediately feel at home and expect to get wonderful stuff done to their hair? I've seen her make the staff of a salon roll up their sleeves and repaint the place. I've seen her refurnish things. I've also seen her, this would be music, we're not going to get into this here, I've seen her actually work with the stylists on problems they have in actually doing the hair. But the last time I watched her, she was in South Beach in Miami, and she made the people in the salon go out on the beach and talk to every single person they found with two things in mind. Number one, here's a flyer for our grand reopening after they had repainted the place and dressed differently and done everything else. Here's our grand reopening in a week. You're all invited. And number two, back up that way on the beach. We've set up a tent. We'll give you a free haircut right now if you want it. So now, maybe this applies to orchestras, maybe it doesn't. But let's suppose Tabitha came to the actual orchestras you work with. And what would she say? Quickly write down a couple of things that she might say. I will telegraph my punches here. The reason for bringing this up is that in addition to community relations being a two-way street, I think it's possible that those of us in the orchestra world and in classical music generally don't think enough and don't know enough about how we look to the outside. And Tabitha certainly brings that lens to bear on hair salons. Actually, she's now branched out into helping small businesses of all kinds. I haven't seen any of those shows. So would anybody like to share what they have written down? Yes?
I noticed last night at the concert that Daniel Lee, who's the principal cellist, stayed on stage during the break. And people came up to talk to him. So maybe Tabitha would come in and say, look, at intermission, yeah, you may need a drink of water, but why don't you come out into the audience or into the hall and interact with the audience on a personal level rather than, I did my job on the stage, now I'm going to go out, take a rest, and I'll come back and do the rest.
And I could add to that, I think that's a really great idea. Looking when you're on stage playing like you might be a person that the audience could talk to. In the 90s, the St. Louis Symphony had marvelous community programs. And I went to a concert in Powell, and I saw before the concert numerous people from the orchestra, from the audience, getting up and saying hello to a musician they'd gotten to know. And I thought that was really beautiful. Some more ideas? Yeah?
In relation to that, there is a British Shakespeare company that tours the world called Propeller.
Yeah?
And in many ways, the highlight of their performance is the intermission, when they go and improvise a
Wow.
that greet the audience.
Yeah. Yeah.
And people assemble waiting for this to happen.
Of course they would.
Yeah.
They don't know what's going to come. Okay, somebody who hasn't spoken yet? Yes.
I've noticed yesterday watching a youth orchestra play and then a professional play, and when they bowed, the youth orchestra kids tried to look professional, but they couldn't resist cracking a smile.
Yes.
And the professionals, they all look, well, most of them look really stern and professional. But I think it's okay to smile.
I think it's okay to smile. I will share this without naming the orchestra. New Year's Eve, Ann and I were flipping channels, and we came across one of our nation's leading orchestras that happened to be playing Rhapsody in Blue. And the close-ups of the orchestra, I'm sorry, they look grim. They're playing Rhapsody in Blue on New Year's Eve. And they look grim. I'm thinking, no, you're on TV. There's a close-up of your face. This is not the way to do it. Yeah.
I think it's interesting because I wrote the exact same things. I think almost all of us are sort of on the same
Yeah.
theme here. That, and I do think our orchestra is friendly and welcoming, but I'm an insider.
Yes.
I think if I were an outsider, I would say, and I would tap the company, I would say, you're serious. You're not welcome from the moment they step in the hall to the no smiling on stage to the glass wall between the orchestra. That, we have to work in the world.
You know, I had a consulting client once in branding from South Africa who was responsible for his music school's concert series and wanted to convey the idea to the public that it was much more diverse than classical music, which didn't seem to be getting across. And one of the ideas we came up with was that he should encourage the ushers at the performance to dress in their brightest, happiest, most individual clothes and really say hello to everybody and establish a mood the minute you walked in. This is diverse. This is not your normal concert series. Instead of all black. At the University of Maryland, wonderful thing the orchestra does, they dress in informal black, and then they're all told to accessorize, if they care to, with an accent color picked for every concert. Blue and green for Mahler 4, red for the Symphonie Fantastique. So I remember I went for Mahler 4, and I'm looking around, look at that, the bass player has blue ribbons from the tuning pegs. And that second violinist, what a gorgeous blue-green shawl. Oh my God, look at the socks on that one. You just look around and you think, it's individual, it's diverse, it's festive, and you get the feeling that they care and that you're happy to be there. It's a really nice innovation. But more people in reacting to Tabitha?
Well, just
Yeah, fine.
comment here. Our orchestra, we're fortunate we have a lot of new, our audience is full of a lot of new folks. And I've learned, me having a traditional classical music background, I learned so much from our audience. They
Yeah.
come late, they get to go to the bathroom, and I'm so nervous, and you have to shut the doors, we can't.
Yeah.
They don't mind, no one minds. And they came to our musicians who aren't up on a stage, but it's all alone. And they're interacting at intermission, and they all,
Yeah, and you know what? You don't know what people think. Very interesting thing at the New World Symphony's terrific presentation yesterday about the new audiences they're getting for new concert formats, that the New World Symphony staff was sort of unanimous about how one of the hosts at the event had not been good, and then they surveyed the audience, and the audience really loved that person. So they thought, oh my God, have to get other points of view. So more reactions to Tabitha? Yeah?
I'm a music director and also a musician in an orchestra. And I'm struck a little bit. I'm kind of torn both ways. I agree with almost everything that's being said here. On the other hand, I keep thinking back, is the audience there to hear? And if we have, for instance, if we have pleading during concerts, somebody that perhaps is in front of me and they're sitting there, I'm going to be distracted by that, and I'd like to not be distracted by that. As a musician, smiling is pretty hard to do on my instrument, which is trumpet. Lawrence Welk did it, I suppose, but I But I'm being facetious, of course, but there's a tremendous pressure on me to play right. And I have a lot of joy, and I hope it comes out when I play. But I think I enjoy coming out and talking to audience members, and I smile when I'm not there. I really do. That's not the issue. I just kind of want to balance what
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up because these are serious questions. Many people will have them, and it really has to be asked. And I run into it all the time. I was in Norway. Can it actually be last week? I think it was last week. I was in Norway taking part of a debate at the Bergen International Festival on the future of classical music. And a lot had been said about musicians and orchestras smiling. And somebody angrily gets up from the audience and says, well, in 1900, when we didn't have these problems, are you going to tell me that those orchestras smiled? And that shows that everything is different? And the whole point is, it's a whole spectrum of things. It's not just smiling. It's just generally looking involved. In 1900, I think you had a natural kind of communion between orchestras and audience that you don't have now. And certainly earlier, in the 1820s, there are wonderful stories about musicians in a German orchestra, the violinists, in those fabulous downward scales in the finale of Beethoven 5, making eye contact with the audience because it was all so new. And people in Paris just crying out in wonder at passages in Beethoven. So one orchestra that looks involved, I actually didn't notice whether they smiled or not, but last time I saw the Berlin Philharmonic, they were playing Mahler 9, and everybody moved. They moved their bodies with the music. And it was especially notable in the bass section in the last movement, because you know the symphony, you know there's a lot up in the basses, and they're practically dancing with their instruments, all of them in a different way. It's not choreographed at all. It's just spontaneous. And I'm thinking, this is probably one of the reasons they had that fabulously deep sound, that their bodies are into it. And I was having some body work done on me, and my body workers said, you know, you're going to think I'm crazy, but the orchestra I like is the Berlin Philharmonic, because I just look at them and I say, they love to play by the way their bodies are. So there are many ways that involvement can be shown. Maybe it's important to have the idea that it should be shown. And then about listening. A historian named William Weber has actually written a paper on listening in the 18th century when everybody talked during performances and then applauded when they heard something. And he's arguing that it's actually a serious form of listening, even if you are not rapt. Now, who knows what goes on in the minds of our normal audience if they're paying attention all the time. I think that somebody who was at the premiere of Mozart's Paris Symphony wrote a letter to his father where he said, I knew there was one passage in the first movement they were going to like, so I made sure to repeat it and then end the movement with it. And sure enough, they did like it, they applauded. So here's an audience that is talking and possibly moving around the performance space. There are paintings showing that. And then they hear something and they applaud. I would say that that is a very involved kind of listening of a kind that we don't know about. Finally, not to spend too much time on this because we actually have to end, hosting and co-programming a concert series some years ago with the Pittsburgh Symphony, tried the experiment of playing the first movement of the Paris Symphony and reading Mozart's letter and saying to the audience, you know what? All of you should feel free to applaud the minute you hear anything that you liked, because that's what Mozart audience did. So they did. So I learned so much from that. The applause was different from moment to moment. The lustiest applause, this really floored me, because this was your famous new audience. These were not trained classical music people. The lustiest applause came in the recapitulation at the place where it diverged from the exposition. And I'm thinking, God damn, they heard that something new was going on. I love that. But the most interesting lesson, because I had talked about this with my Juilliard classes, as you know, we read Mozart's letter, we talk about what would happen now, and people say, oh, you know, there's a danger. They'll just be clapping and they won't be listening and they won't hear. So I noticed in Pittsburgh that everybody clapped when they heard something new and when something that they liked. And when something new happened, they stopped clapping so that they could hear it. And I have a feeling they were listening more intently than other audiences. So maybe we reconfigure the idea of what it means to listen. This is radical. And it's not appropriate for every piece. You're doing Mahler 9. There are places like that where I would kill an audience that applauded personally myself. But on the other hand, I haven't seen it, so I don't know. Listen, probably because I have talked a little too much. We're running to the end. But is there anything that people would like to say in the 5 minutes we have left, just reacting to this whole discussion? I have loved what has come from you, and I think that if the thoughts that you've expressed there start really becoming active in your orchestras, we may get to that 2023 place, which I would personally love. But thoughts from any of you? Yeah.
I wanted to follow up on the comment about orchestra
Yeah.
players being physical. And I think it's a kind of cultural difference. You see it a lot more in European orchestras.
Yeah.
You don't see it in American orchestras. I'm from North Carolina. I work at the University of North Carolina, but I'm often a cover conductor at the North Carolina Symphony in Raleigh. And at one of the rehearsals I attended, Grant Llewellyn, the music director, was conducting Haydn Symphony, and came up the aisle and we started talking. He said, "You know, they're not moving around at all. They just look like they're into the music." And he went up on stage in the rehearsal and told the orchestra, "Can you move around a little? And you have these big accents and scales. Show the audience," and there was no audience at that point yet, but that you are involved with the music. And he was very well aware because Grant is Welsh and spends a lot of his time in Europe. But I think it is a cultural thing, and I get frustrated when I see American orchestras just sitting there very stolid and not even reacting or displaying what is in the music.
Yeah, tricky.
These Berlin videos, which are sensational,
Yeah.
as you said.
Very tricky in orchestra culture to think how this discussion could start to happen internally. Yeah.
Our music director and conductor, Daniel Hickey, we played, can't pull the number out of my head right now, the Haydn Symphony where it has several trick endings. And,
Yes.
he actually, I did not, I was in the part of the orchestra that was not playing, and so I got put out the audience, and he purposefully wanted the audience to be tricked and to clap at the wrong time. I mean, he played it up and he hammed it up, and at one point he actually walked off the podium, had a musician stop him and turn him around as the applause.
Oh, I love
And
it.
get back on stage. And this was something where we were playing it with Carmina Burana, so we knew that there would be new people, and we wanted to get this air of we're not so serious. And so he gets back on stage, and people loved it.
Of course they did.
And, he's a really personable conductor, and he loves to talk to people, but that was something that, for a large new audience, I think, did
And
something
you know,
cool.
the larger thing looking to 2023 is that if you do things like that, and they don't all have to be stunts and they don't all have to be jokes, but if you do things that make the concerts something beyond the music, so they're events, so that somebody who comes to it says, "Oh my God, I went to the orchestra and you can't believe what they did," then you start getting some buzz. Then you also run into the difficult question of, isn't it about the music and aren't we detracting from the music if we do that? And I think we have to understand that music is a larger phenomenon than simply listening to the notes. And if you go back into the history of classical music, you find that big time, that they really acted as if the show was the important thing and that the music was a part of that, but that the way it was presented, certainly the audience's reaction to it, was an important part of it. I mean, you have Handel, for example, the first time he produced an opera in London, releasing doves in the air for a garden scene. Very bad. They did what birds do, and the audience was not happy. But, you know, it was an idea. Yeah?
A number of years ago, went to New York Phil concert that Ricardo Muti conducted, and on the program was Ravel's Bolero. I said, "Oh, no, not again."
Yeah.
But we found out afterwards he didn't rehearse it to any extent.
Oh, wow.
He just said, "Play it how you feel." So in the bassoon solo, the female principal bassoon had an off-the-shoulder dress, and as she was playing dum da da da, her shoulders were rolling.
Whoa.
It was the most beautiful performance of Ravel's Bolero I had ever seen.
Yeah, but you know what? I just want to say, in the interests of seriousness and artistic leadership, that getting back to Mahler 9, which is one of my all-time favorite pieces, that one of the things people might come back saying is, I heard this piece, I felt the universe shifting as it's played, and I know the orchestra felt that too because of the way they looked. And we're not talking now about signaling punchlines to the orchestra audience. We're just talking about the sense of deep, rapt, spiritual immersion in what you're doing that nobody could possibly miss, whether they know and love classical music or not. That is actually my dream. I'm going to end with this. I talk so much in my work about performance enhancements, if you will, changing the whole atmosphere of the thing. But what I really would like to see are performances that are so vivid, so compelling, so unmistakably powerful and right that people don't need anything more than that to be riveted. And I think, though I haven't talked about that, that this is a frontier that we might think about. We're all playing the music pretty well. I've heard a lot of American orchestras, large and small. We're all playing the music pretty well, but are we really playing it jumping out of our seats well? When we get to a big climax, is it so climactic that nobody could possibly miss? And you think, you know, about Haydn writing these symphonies for Prince Esterhazy's Summer Palace. This was for the entertainment of the prince's guests. And if those false endings didn't come across, fail, fire the guy because he's not really delivering. So I think in the past, there was probably a lot of consciousness of this, however it was conveyed. And I would like to see our performances and hear so powerful and vivid that nobody in the audience can possibly miss that something exciting is going on. Thank you all so much.